it is already a lost cause. Targeted sanctions on individuals and institutions, travel restrictions, asset freezes.
It almost seems hard to believe at this stage, but if we go into a world of targeted sanctions against certain individuals or groups of institutions, individuals in this country, often get a doubling down. They turn inward, leaders turn inward and treat the domestic economy as their fiefdom because they've lost access. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
And in the case of South Africa, the country is already some way down the road of fiefdoms, exploiting political opportunities in order to enrich themselves. The construction mafia is 247.
Guys, it's getting really heated. So I just woke up this morning to news, although this is actually almost stale, but it says that US officials, right, they're about to introduce a law to sanction private individuals in South Africa. And most times when I study African history, I have a PhD in African history, I've actually mostly seen this kind of sanctions on individuals in terms of like cases of like probably genocide. All right, so I know that there were some sanctions on some of the participants or probably what was called proponents of the Rwandan genocide. I think there's been some on on some sanctions on some Congolese individuals. I mean, like in terms of individuals, sanctions to individuals, probably coming from the International Criminal Court and all of that. But for South Africa here, Donald Trump's regime, I'm seeing a really strange flip to that whole scenario. So it says that the officials in the parliament of the US, I think it says that they want to introduce law to sanction South Africa. And this sanction now is actually supposed to target officials who support their adversaries. Bro, this is deep. So I got this from businesstech.co.za, and I usually read their news a lot, but this is actually interesting. And one of the reasons I actually kind of like went through to go through this is that they placed a document. I'll place the link to that document in the show notes here, which is a PDF document, you know, that actually shows the full text of this bill as it was actually being narrated in US Parliament. In other words, so this guy is actually planning to sanction individuals, probably individuals in the ANC, all right, you know, and all of that. So this is strange. So I'll just go through the news so we just really understand what's really going on. It says US Congressman Ronnie Jackson, all right, introduced the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025, which called for a full review of the bilateral relationship between the US and South Africa. It says that Jackson, now this Jackson, who is a US congressman, his office said that the bill would help to advance US President Donald Trump's foreign policy agenda by giving him the tools necessary to impose sanctions on South African officials, bro, who support America's adversaries. So in other words, officials in South Africa, or probably South African government, who support enemies of the US would actually be receiving sanctions. And I'm trying to still figure out how those sanctions would work. Would it be a ban on their travel? Would it be, I don't really know. If the US places these sanctions, would South Africa need to implement them? Or if probably ANC secretary, for example, receives a sanction. So if probably the sanctions now would be that they would never be able to visit the US, or it's just for me really strange. But let's keep on going. Now, in this news, it says that America clarifies the sanctions. It said these adversaries with these South African officials who should receive these sanctions, the countries they support, the adversaries, so to speak, they include China, Russia, and Iran. All right. So it says that Jackson is now saying, this Congressman Jackson, he says South Africa has brazenly abandoned its relationship with the United States to align with China, Russia, Iran, and terrorist organizations, a betrayal that demands serious consequences, Jackson says. So it's getting really heated, guys. Let's keep going. Jackson now still saying, he says this legislation ensures we conduct a comprehensive review of this supposed ally while also holding accountable any corrupt officials. Jackson is a firm supporter of Israel and serves as the co-chair of the Congressional Israel Allies Caucus. Now, Jackson continues. He says, the era of governments undermining American interests without repercussions ends now. That sounds a little bit of a top-down kind of like tonality. But anyway, probably this would be kind of like these governments who have actually signed bilateral agreements with the US, all right, and probably depend a lot on US services and all of that. So for those kinds of governments, for them to probably move against US interests, I think these are the kind of people Jackson is referring to here, that, you know, they would not do that anymore without attracting repercussions, all right? But anyway, let's keep on going. So this bill now passed by Jackson. Jackson is trying to say that the bill has also received support from US Congressman John James. So these are two congressmen who are trying to pass this bill. John James is now saying, he says, the South African government and the ANC have continued to consistently undermine US national security interests, and in recent years have intentionally aligned with Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran, and pursued an anti-Israel agenda. All right, so that's from John James. He also says that the United States must examine all of our bilateral relationships around the world and investigate all options to hold those countries and leaders who align with our adversaries responsible. All right, so it's really interesting. And the bill here has, you know, the details of the bill. I'll be going through them. But I just wanted, before we go through them, there's a question that this CEO of Sakeliga, I just found the organization yesterday. It says it's a non-for-profit organization, Sakeliga. All right. So he asked a very interesting question to Franz Cronje, which I thought for me, especially as an academic, is so interesting. He asked him that, you know, the whole thing with sanctions on individuals seems to be like a strange phenomenon which could backfire, because these guys who received these sanctions probably over history have decided now to convert their own countries to fiefdoms, because they have actually now probably lost in a way and now do not have external exposure. So now they concentrate the power and further oppress their own, you know, locale, and try to convert it to a fiefdom, thereby imposing more human rights, you know, probably abuses and all of that. I think probably we could actually see this. What comes to my mind now is a Pol Pot. I don't know if you guys know the history of the Pol Pot regime in, you know, in history anyway. But this is actually Franz Cronje's response to that, and I think it's really interesting. Let's quickly listen, and I'll be back for the details of what this law that the congressmen in the US are wishing to pass to impose sanctions on South Africa, so that it could help us start thinking about what would be the ramifications, for example, if some key ANC officials are poised for sanctions by the US.
What do you think's at stake here? I mean, are things like targeted sanctions a realistic prospect?
I would say yes. I mean, we saw today Mexico and Canada are at their 25%. You saw the reception that Mr. Zelensky got in the Oval Office. I think if your assumption is, of some of your leadership, that it is already a lost cause, you've already lost here. You'll look at your fallback positions, Namibia and Angola. Then your view further is that to make it a winnable cause, it can't grow at 1% forever. You're going to lose here eventually. In that case, I think that it's perfectly plausible to think that there will be a ratcheting up of measures. Targeted sanctions on individuals and institutions, travel restrictions, asset freezes, all the way out perhaps to something as serious as sanctions or restrictions on foreign financial institutions holding South African government debt. You know, South Africans borrow very little in dollars because they've been wise since the Mandela days to the very real risk that holds, that you will eventually surrender your sovereignty to some bureaucrat in Washington.
That dollar component has been going up.
It has been going up, but it's been going up modestly.
Yeah.
But the idea, well, if it goes up modestly, we're safe because the domestic borrowing can't be. No, you're wrong. The domestic borrowing can also be compromised. Ability. If so, I think it would be perfectly correct, plausible to think that if the South Africans do not find a way to deal with these core three issues with the US, then such measures might very well follow.
You talk to a number of companies in your consulting work, Franz. Are people doing some hard thinking around some of these potential possibilities? I mean, if we go into a world of, and it almost seems hard to believe at this stage, but if we go into a world of targeted sanctions against certain individuals or groups of institutions, individuals in this country, I mean, that has interesting and important ripple implications for corporate associations, for dealings, for board member structures, all these kinds of things. Are there some conversations
anyone
happening around it?
who's tried to navigate the consequences of the sanctions applied to Russia after the start of the conflict in the Ukraine would have had a taste of just how far these tentacles can extend and just how serious the implications can be for the individuals involved.
Yeah, so there's that side of it. My other point here is I have a bit of skepticism on the efficacy of these sorts of moves. That's just something to explore as well. My perception is that when you get things like targeted sanctions, justified or unjustified, on a Mugabe regime or on a Chavez regime or so on, you often get a doubling down. They turn inward, leaders turn inward and treat the domestic economy as their fiefdom because they've lost access, because these things are happening. And I just think there needs to be real caution for kind of just calling for things like targeted sanctions in an environment where that could cause unintended harmful consequences. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
I don't know if in the longer term that fully applies. I think that if you concede that the basis of all political action, diplomatic action, is the ability to secure deterrence by forcing consequences, and you then begin to second guess yourself, then you're losing. And in the case of South Africa, the country is already some way down the road of fiefdoms exploiting political opportunities in order to enrich themselves. The construction mafia is to foretell what could happen across much of the country's economy. And, we can talk about it here, but my read of it is, reality is the thing that's still there even when you've stopped believing in it. And the Trump administration is real. Its post-liberal approach to the world is real. Its willingness to force deterrence is demonstrated over and over again. So I don't think there's much of a discussion to be had about the nuances one way or another, because the philosophy that underpins it has made a firm break with that end of history. To say it's hard power based on deterrence. If you do not comply, you will face the consequences. And I suspect that at odds with many other observers of this sort of thing, that in the fullness of time, this may bring about a safer and more stable and more prosperous world. But there may, of course, be exceptions where things go somewhat awry. But I would guess that in many of those cases, things were already going very much awry, and this was simply a final impetus as opposed to a set of actions, the sanctions, that took a society that was moving in the right direction, reoriented it, and after that it moved in the wrong direction, began to fall apart. It simply accelerates perhaps policies and ideas that were already well established.
So, you could hear for yourself Franz Cronje really making some really intelligent thoughts there, saying that South Africa already feels like a fiefdom. It's already almost down to part to the fiefdom, and so the effect of the negative effect of the whole consequences of imposing sanctions on probably possible ANC officials won't have much per se, because the consequence is already a part of the society. This is according to the thinking of Franz Cronje. But anyway, this bill now, in terms of the details of this bill says okay, I'll just read quickly. It says that the bill states that no later than 120 days after the enactment, the president, that's Donald Trump now, in consultation with the Secretary of State, and that will be Marco Rubio, and the Secretary of the Treasury, they shall submit an appropriate congressional committees. They shall submit to the appropriate congressional committees a classified report, including 1, a list of senior South African government officials and ANC leaders that the president determines have engaged in corrupt and human rights abuses. 2, the report would also include a detailed explanation describing the conduct forming the basis of the person's inclusion on the list and the expected timeline for the sanctions. Now, he goes on to say that the bill also states that the South Africa's government foreign policy actions have long ceased to reflect its stated stance of non-alignment. I think this was the shield that South Africa has enjoyed for many years, that, its foreign policy always preferred a certain state of non-alignment, in its relationship with countries of the world. But now the US is actually saying that, the foreign policies, especially when they are read, have actually proven that South Africa seems to have moved away from its stance as a non-aligned state. And so it now and they argue that this is because it has been favoring Hamas, the Russian Federation, and China. So now, this bill that is about to be passed by this congressman says the bill identifies 8 key problem areas with the ANC and South Africa. 1, the ANC policies are consistent with South Africa's stated policy of non-alignment in international affairs. So this is a problem that this bill is trying to really build as a basis for its passage, that the fact that the ANC's policies are inconsistent with South Africa's stated policy of non-alignment in international affairs, all right? 2, the South African government has a history of siding with malign actors, including Hamas, a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization, and a proxy of the Iranian regime. And then it continues to pursue closer ties with the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. 3, the South African government's continued support of Hamas. 4, members of South African government delivering anti-Semitic and anti-Israel statements and actions following the October 7th attacks by Hamas. 5, the South African government and the ANC maintain close relations with the Russian Federation, which has been accused of perpetrating war crimes in Ukraine and indiscriminately undermining human rights. 6, the South African government's interactions with the People's Republic of China government and the ANC's interaction with the Chinese Communist Party, who are committing gross violations of human rights in the Xinjiang province and implementing economically coercive tactics around the world. Probably this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump is slapping China with as high as 145% tariff. That's really brutal. But I don't know, really, this whole argument with the Chinese Communist Party committing gross violations of human rights in the Xinjiang province and implementing economically coercive tactics around the globe. That's stories for another day. But anyway, the 7th point with this bill is actually basing its passage on is the fact that it argues that the ANC-led South African government history of substantially mismanaging a range of state resources and often being proven incapable of effectively delivering public services, threatening the South African people and the South African economy. This is actually almost like the voice of in my PhD thesis, I used to speak about Jerry Rawlings having a savior complex, so to speak. So in other words, it appears that the US really wants to now move in to really help support the cries of maybe some South African people who have been crying about the mismanagement of state resources, and probably the likes of you could see in my last video where Rob Hersov argues that CADA deployment destroyed state-owned enterprises in South Africa. So it's really interesting how this bill would pass anyway. And the final point, it says that the most recent comments by former ambassador to the US, Ibrahim Rasool, describing President Trump as extreme and characterizing him as a white supremacist. So these are the basis for which the US wants now to pass a bill that will targeted sanctions on South African officials, and I really don't know yet what these sanctions would be or the implementation or what they could result in. Maybe it would result in closing of their bank accounts all over the world, and that would be brutal, because if most of these guys who have actually stolen some money were in Nigeria, I think many African countries anyway, they are guilty of this. And this is something that many youth in Africa have been crying about, especially the banks. I think some of the banks, I think it was in Switzerland, that some of these countries that actually serve as offshore havens or tax havens, so to speak. Most of the officials in Africa, stolen money anyway, usually goes to this. So imagine targeting some of the stolen money, or maybe some of these, not stolen per se, but maybe closing the bank accounts, international bank accounts of some individuals who have actually been designated to be on this sanctions list. That would be a blow, bro, to some of these officials, and I really don't know. It would really be a brutal one. But anyway, this is the bill that the US is considering to pass to target South African officials, and I really don't know what the implications are, but I'll be following this story because I'm really interested to see how sanctioned by US, the United States, and not now the ICC or others, will be passing a sanction to another country's officials, based on certain arguments. It will really be interesting to follow up. But anyway, I don't know. What do you guys think about this? I think for me, it's a really interesting one and quite new. I'll really be following this up. But share your thoughts, guys, in the comments.